Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back, guys. We are now on to part 3. Let's see if we can finish this all up. It's going to finish up here with them going back and forth with the presenter, and then they'll get into some Q&A sessions. We'll see. Either we'll do part 3 and we'll end it here, or we'll do part 3 and 4. Let's get into it.
The country, they were not even allowed to give them to the soldiers. They were stored in the west of the country, not even given to the soldiers anti-tank missiles. How on earth could this be an existential threat to the second biggest army in the world that the Russians had? So if you go to this, there's nothing in this particular story. And the entire NATO expansion, just to go into the military aspect of it, if we sort of deal with the NATO thing, up to 2000.
Again, if you guys took a pause between part 2 and this part, this guy's making the argument that there's no existential threat right now, and we're talking about 2022 or beforehand, to Russia from Ukraine. Yeah. We understand. We understand, Carl. It's not about right now. It's about a future threat. It's about the idea of NATO being in Ukraine. Like, this guy totally lost the argument, so he's trying to change the foundation of the argument itself.
2004 was the expansion, Poland and those countries, long time ago by now. But there was no NATO infrastructure, there was no troops whatsoever moving east. Nothing. With the exception of 2 fighter aircraft in the Baltic states doing air policing as a reaction to 9/11. It was only, and as a matter of fact, 2000, and all of the countries were taking down their defense expenditure in the West. 2013, the Americans took away their very last battle tank from Europe. We were all going down. We were doing nothing whatsoever. Then came Crimea. Then came his pressure on Ukraine. Then came Novorossiya. Then came the invasions of 2014. Then NATO started to give forces to the countries in the East because they said, we are afraid. We don't know what the man is up to. But prior to that, neutrality was in the constitution of Ukraine, and there were no NATO forces whatsoever in the new member states since 2004. So where is the existential threat? There was no one there who was going to invade and take down the Kremlin.
Well, there doesn't have to be an existential threat today. This could be, bringing Ukraine into NATO could be a stepping stone to bringing NATO forces.
You said that Putin was desperate when he launched the invasion. Desperate about what? I mean, it was not, diplomatic reporting, newspapers, there was no one talking about anything whatsoever, except the fact that the Donbas issue was unresolved. 14,000 people died. We should not forget that in the fighting in Donbas. But it was no threat to Russia in February of this year, none whatsoever. There is no justification whatsoever for the invasion.
Look, you're talking about bringing a military alliance that was a military foe. Right? It was a foe of the Soviet Union. And you're taking that military alliance and bringing it up to Russia's doorstep.
I'm sorry, John, but I think you and Putin are the only ones in the world who believe that that NATO was going to allow Ukraine in February of this year. There's no one else
that it was going to allow.
But how can you argue
allow Ukraine to be a member of NATO? It was not on the table.
It was on the table. It was becoming a de facto member of NATO, and we had redoubled our commitment to bringing it into NATO.
We had no forces there. They were
You
not
don't
members.
need forces there.
But
we didn't have forces in Poland, and we brought Poland into NATO.
John.
And now Finland is going into NATO. Estonia has been a member. Norway is a member of NATO.
I don't dispute that, but what is that going to do to the Russians? That's just going to scare the Russians even more.
One final question, okay.
It is not a threat to
Carl
Russia.
and John.
See how this guy's making his arguments as if like he thinks John is an idiot or the viewers are idiots? Guys, what are you talking about, bro? Nobody's arguing over it right now. Nobody is arguing about right now. And then again, he tries to like rewrite history by saying nobody was talking about Ukraine joining NATO. John Mearsheimer literally said NATO itself at the conference did a write-up saying they were going to do that. Like, come on. What are we talking about here? There's historical evidence that they wanted Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. And look at what happened to both countries. There's no like clear link anybody can see.
Or, yeah.
Now I cut. Now one final question, because in 2008, when Putin went to the Bucharest meeting and said this is a red line, the situation was far away from the Cold War. At the time, Russian ships were participating in a NATO operation in the Mediterranean. There was no threat comparable to that during the Cold War. Now, I want to bring us up to now, because, and I want both of you to answer to this, but I want to start with you, Carl, because for Europe, February of this year was a watershed in terms of how we relate to Ukraine and to Russia. Up until that point, dialogue had kind of been the name of the game to bring the troubles in Ukraine to a halt. And even after 2014, Germany and France participated in the Minsk agreement to bring the conflict to a halt through diplomatic negotiations. But now we are in a very different situation in Europe. Many European countries, including Norway and Sweden, are outright declining the prospects of negotiating with Russia, particularly after the annexation of the four oblasts. The new European mantra seems to be the battlefield must first exhaust its potential. Now, what does this say about the prospects for getting this war to some type of halt? And you said so in your intervention, that there are two principles for European security today. First, aggression will never be tolerated. Second, borders must be respected. They cannot be altered by force. Now you are saying that we will not negotiate, nobody will negotiate in Europe or allow negotiations before Ukrainian territory has been reconquered. Is this what you are saying, or what other type of precedent can Europe accept? Because this will set a precedent for security in Europe for decades to come.
It certainly will. And it's, of course, not for Norway or Sweden to negotiate with Russia. Any sort of peace, if that was to come, will have to be between Ukraine and Russia. So it's up to the Ukrainians to define. Borders can be changed. I said borders can't be changed by force. They can be changed with agreement. But Ukrainians are very determined to keep that territory. That's not entirely unique if you go in European history. I mean, there are very few nations that are prepared to give away that territory to someone else who is invading them. They fight for their freedom. And I think the Ukrainians will fight for their freedom. And we will support them. And why do we support them? Well, we support them because, first, Russia is an aggressor, and secondly, because of these principles are at stake. If we sort of allow Russia to change borders by force and by aggression against Ukraine, we don't know what's going to be the continuation. I don't think necessarily they're going to invade Sweden tomorrow, but the fact that the Finns, the day after, more or less, the day after, February 24th, every single Finn thought about one thing, 1939, when Stalin attacked. And they said, we can no longer be safe without going into NATO. So I agree with you, and I think we agree on that. Prospects for peace are at the moment fairly bleak. It will be decided on the battlefield at some point in time. Diplomacy will come. But I will certainly give my support to Ukraine, fighting for its freedom and independence.
Does this look different in the countries that are closer to the Russian border?
It does.
And for the countries that are further away from the Russian border?
It does, obviously. Obviously. I mean, I go to Tallinn, go to Riga, go to Warsaw, go to Vilnius, rightly or wrongly. Go to Chisinau, which has now lost all of the electricity because of Russian bombing. Rightly or wrongly, they believe they are next. That might be wrong, but they believe they are next.
I think you have to be careful, though, because of the case of Hungary. if you were to look at Hungary and Poland, they have fundamentally different views of how to deal with Russia.
They do.
Hungary shares a border with Ukraine, as
Yep.
does Poland.
Yeah,
So-
but not with Russia.
And how do you explain that difference?
That's an historical.
Yeah, I think that the Poles have a hatred of the Russians that almost knows no bounds and sees the Russians, the Poles tend to see the Russians as the font of all evil. I think the Hungarians have a more circumspect view of the Russian threat.
So you look then at historical animosity as coming into the equation.
Yeah, I think we would agree that the Baltic states and Poland, given the history.
But isn't this the problem of Europe? Because what Putin did in February of this year was basically to say that the institutions that the Europeans have built since the Second World War, and particularly after 2000 or 1990, and that you have been contributing to vastly, was the objective of having institutions in Europe that would prevent war between nations in Europe from ever returning again, and at the same time have economic cooperation. For instance, buying every possible drop of gas from Russia that was possible so that Russia would not, even think about importing the use of military invasion as a way of pressuring the situation in Europe. Now, these means did not work to prevent Putin from invading Ukraine. What now for Europe?
True, we built the Helsinki Principles, the Paris Charter, to go back, Helsinki Principles, OSCE. We have ongoing, as we speak, in Lodz in Poland, a ministerial meeting of the OSCE. Lavrov Russians are no longer there because they have violated every single part of what was agreed in the OSCE. So they are no longer allowed into that. That's a massive failure. Highly regrettable. I mean, I spent a lot of my time as foreign minister and prior to that, even as prime minister, trying to engage Russia in cooperation. And we did fairly well for a while. But things went wrong at some point in time. And I date it from the return of, it was problematic before. I mean, there's always been problems. I mean, it happens. But I date it really from the return of Putin on his third term. We see a distinct shift of policy when he tried to build up something that was entirely new, and when he tried to squeeze Ukraine into something, and then he went from one disaster to the other. And I think quite certain that Putin will go down in Russian history as a disaster who has created immense damage to Russia itself by misreading, misunderstanding, and mishandling the most important neighbor that Russia could have had, that is Ukraine.
How do you react to this?
I want to pick up on the question that you asked, Carl, and your story of what NATO and the West was up to. My argument, which is consistent with what Cecilia said, is that up until the crisis in Ukraine broke out in 2014, okay, NATO expansion and EU expansion and the color revolution, this three-pronged strategy, was not designed to contain Russia. Russia was not seen as a threat. It was designed to turn Eastern Europe into a giant zone of peace. It was designed to take those institutions that had done so much to create peace in the west of Europe and move them eastward. The idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO in 2008 was not designed to poke the Russians in the eye or to contain the Russians. You might not believe this, but Vladimir Putin was invited to the April 2008 Bucharest conference. He was not seen as an imperialist up until February 22nd, 2014. And that's why I said, once the crisis broke out, we had to invent a story that he was an imperialist. He took power in 2000, Putin. From 2000 to 2014, according to my higher math, that's 14 years, over those 14 years, nobody was arguing that he was an imperialist. He all of a sudden, overnight, became an imperialist after February 22nd, because we had to blame him for the crisis. We couldn't admit that we caused it. But you see, we caused it. It's the hell of good intentions. I believed that you and your friends had good intentions. You thought that by spreading these institutions eastward, you would create a giant zone of peace in Europe. But it backfired, and it backfired over Ukraine because, as Bill Burns said, Ukraine was the brightest of bright red lines.
We are not going to get into the bottom of the why. The question now is what will happen to Europe going forward, because the type of deterrent that we thought was going to prevent the return of war, institutional building and economic cooperation, did not prevent Russia from going to war. In fact, when we have constructed the institutions in Europe after the Second World War, we have constructed institutions precisely for the objective of preventing states from invading neighboring states with the argument that there is a minority across the border that we need to protect, which is exactly what Germany did in 1939, in which, by the way, is exactly the argument that Putin also used in February of this year. After that, Russia has withdrawn or been excluded from a number of the organizations that we have in Europe to prevent further conflict. We are looking for a decoupling, in part, economically speaking, between Russia and Belarus on the one side and the EU and Western Europe on the other. What are going to be the deterrent mechanisms preventing further conflict going forward in Europe?
That we don't know. But you are correct, they are de facto no longer part of the OSCE, they have de facto left. They have left the Council of Europe, which of course has to do primarily with human rights and democracy, which they are not very much in favor of. They have left a lot of economic cooperation. They cut the gas supply. Mind you, it's not that the EU has any sanctions on gas from Russia as of yet. It is Russia that is cut in order to influence the politics of the European countries. Where do we go in the future? We don't know. But as I said, I don't know where Russia is going to be a couple of years from now. I don't think Mr. Putin is going to be there. I'm fairly certain he's not going to be there. It could be chaos and conflict in the country. You can see the so-called power vertical that he's been running the country on. I think that will disappear. I think you will have different interests in Russia fighting it out. I think it will be very quite chaotic. The time of troubles, to take a phrase out of Russian history, will come back. Will there be an even more militaristic regime for a while? Could be, but I don't think it's going to survive very long. Will there be more normal forces asserting themselves? As I said, even Alexei Navalny being able to stand in a free and fair elections. I don't think that's the most likely scenario, but I wouldn't exclude that either. Russia is going to face a very, very difficult future, Ukraine even more. But we will help Ukraine to rebuild, hopefully to stabilize its democracy, hopefully to secure Ukraine, because if we don't secure Ukraine, we won't get a secure Europe. And then we can't really influence what's going to happen in Russia very much.
How does the US scholar look at this?
Yeah, I would actually like to use my time to ask Carl a question. One thing that strikes me, just listening to you talk, and I think it's true of a lot of people who I interact with, is I place a great emphasis on the nuclear threat. I live in fear that this is going to turn into a nuclear war. And my argument is that, as I said in my formal presentation, that the more successful we are, we meaning the West and the Ukrainians, the more likely it is that the Russians will use nuclear weapons. I'm surprised that you don't see that threat, that you don't worry about that. I mean, you talk about supporting the Ukrainians and whipping the Russians, right? And in a conventional world, you can think in an all-conventional world, you can think in those terms. But why aren't you scared, like I am, that this could spin out of control and we could all get vaporized?
No, no, I would be scared of that. I belong to those that gives a somewhat higher percentage of possibility of him in a desperate situation actually using a nuclear device. I don't rule it out, because I think the man in a certain situation could be extremely desperate. I think that would be the end of the entire thing. I think it would collapse internally in Russia if he does that, but that's a separate issue. But I will not give in to nuclear blackmail. Because if we were to do that and said, well, he's threatening with nuclear weapons as he does, so we cave in, we give up, then be damn certain he will learn that particular lesson. And he will threaten the one or the others with nuclear weapons, and we will give in. So giving in to nuclear blackmail is highly dangerous, and we must not do that. We are now trying to, and American and European diplomacy is doing that, building as much as a firewall against him using nuclear weapons as we can. Engaging the Chinese, has been doing in the last few weeks, and the Chinese have been fairly good at saying that we shouldn't threaten nuclear weapons in the way that Putin is doing. Engaging the Indians and others.
Yeah.
Will that help? I don't know. But giving in to nuclear blackmail, I wouldn't do that.
But the thing is, Carl, when you're dealing with a rival great power that has thousands of nuclear weapons, there are limits to how far you can push against that great power. You can't threaten its survival in any way. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I do agree with that.
But you're talking about...
No, but asking Putin to go back and respect the borders of Ukraine is hardly to threaten the survival. It's not that we are threatening to invade Moscow. That's not going to happen. But asking him to go back to February 24th is hardly to threaten the survival of Russia. And if he wants to threaten nuclear weapons by trying to use nuclear weapons to defend the parts of Ukraine that he is already trying to take over, I wouldn't give in to nuclear blackmail, because I think that would be extremely dangerous. He would then use nuclear blackmail on the one issue after the other.
Okay, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but basically what you're saying is that you understand that there's a serious risk of nuclear war if we succeed in Ukraine, but you're willing to live with that risk.
No, I wouldn't use the word nuclear war. But a nuclear war involves both using nuclear weapons. I think even if Washington hasn't been explicit, but Washington has been very clear that if he sets off a nuke, the Americans will not set off a nuke. So we will not get a nuclear war. The response will be there, but will not be nuclear. And there are other ways
what will the response be? Because many people believe that what will happen is if the Russians use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, that, as Carl says, almost everybody agrees, we will not retaliate with nuclear weapons.
Yeah,
okay?
So it's not a nuclear war.
But many people believe that what we will do is retaliate with conventional weapons against Russian forces. Then you have a great power war, United States versus Russia. And Avril Haines, who is the director of national intelligence in the United States, she told the Senate Armed Services Committee in the spring of this year that that's the most likely scenario for Putin to use nuclear weapons. Because if the Russians can't beat the Ukrainians on the battlefield, you can imagine what will happen when they're up against Godzilla, also known as the United States and its allies, right? So she was hypothesizing, I think quite correctly, that that's the scenario where...
And that signaling is what's called deterrence. That the Americans are making clear, rightly so, that if he goes nuclear, things will happen. If the Americans were saying instead that if he uses nuclear weapons, we don't really care and we've got to back off, then it would be the end of this particular conflict. Then Putin will win and he will continue. So don't give in to nuclear blackmail. I think if he uses nuclear weapons, the world will turn against him even more decisively. I'm not quite certain that it would be very acceptable in Moscow either, I have to say. I think it might implode the political regime if it does.
Yeah, but that's after he's used them.
Now, if we in one moment expand the perspective beyond Europe and NATO and Russia and China and look at the rest of the world, one of the ways of showing for Russia that Russia is a global power is permanent seat of the UN Security Council, which Russia is using in order to prove that Russia is a global power. Now, if Russia were to use nuclear weapons, what will happen to the legitimacy of the Russian seat if Russia were to do that? Because the UN Security Council has had one major task over the past 30 years, and it is to prevent nuclear proliferation. This is what gathers all the permanent members, the one issue where they can agree. Now, if Russia were to use it, it would itself exclude Russia from that club. Wouldn't you say that that would be a major consequence for Russia?
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Look, states use nuclear weapons, pursue extreme strategies that involve using nuclear weapons when they're desperate, when they think they face an existential threat and they're losing. This was my point to Carl, that Carl's advocating a policy that puts the Russians in a position where they're losing, and that's a situation where they're likely to use nuclear weapons. It's like the Japanese attacking at Pearl Harbor. If you've never studied this case, you should go read about it. The Japanese understood full well.
Before we get into this understanding here from John, I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? Guys, why do you have nuclear weapons? It's not because you're going to use it every day. It's not because you're going to use it at all unless you are forced to. It's your last resort. So the more desperate that the Russians get, the likelihood of them using a nuclear weapons increases, because you're getting them towards that last resort. You're pushing them to desperation. The more they lose this war, the more desperate they become, and the more they have to go towards that last resort, because they're not going to lose without using a nuclear weapon, essentially. They'd rather use a nuclear weapon than lose the war. That's pretty much the reality of the situation for every country who has a nuclear weapon, is they'd rather use that than accept defeat.
That attacking the United States of America in December 1949 was not a good idea, in the sense that the United States had 10 times the gross national product of Japan, and the United States was capable of building much more formidable military forces and ultimately crushing Japan. Nevertheless, the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor because we were strangling the Japanese. We had cut off scrap iron in 1940. We had cut off oil in 1941. They were highly dependent on imports of scrap iron and oil from the United States. Their economy was in desperate straits, and we just kept squeezing and squeezing. They thought their survival as a great power was at stake, and therefore they were willing to pursue a risky strategy, a highly risky strategy. And the kinds of considerations that you're talking about go out the window in situations like that. It's not that you're wrong that that would happen to the Russians, that they would suffer in terms of how other states perceive them. It would have negative consequences for proliferation. I don't dispute that. My point is that is of minor consideration in a world where you think you're going off the cliff.
What do you think? Carl?
No, just go back to sort of the beginning of the war, and you say Russia perceiving existential threat, and so I think you saw as well, probably several times, you've seen this sort of meeting of the National Security Council on February the 21st, when Putin calls in all of the sort of members of the National Security Council and asks them what to do. And it was obvious that it wasn't pre-planned that much. And he asked them one after the another. He wanted one particular answer. We should grab Donbass. That's the answer he wanted. Most of them tried to avoid giving that answer. He had to publicly humiliate his head of external intelligence. The man who was responsible for Donbass said explicitly at that particular meeting that he thought the policy was wrong. There was virtually, the prime minister looked like he had wanted to disappear from the meeting altogether. It was only a couple of them that demonstrated even the vaguest enthusiasm for what they suspected or suddenly saw that Putin was intending to do. This was a decision for war driven by President Putin himself. It wasn't really supported very much by the Russian security elite. I agree with you. There's certainly no enthusiasm in Moscow for NATO expansion into Ukraine. But there was hardly anyone in Moscow who saw that possibility either. But there was even less enthusiasm, even in the ruling circles in Moscow, I would argue, for going to war with Ukraine. They were forced into it by Putin, and you can see it so vividly clear in that particular meeting that we have the transcript of and that we can see on the video. It was a Putin decision driven by, if you read all of his speeches and his historical vision and how he says it was a mistake to set up Ukraine and it... Är det amerikansk propaganda? Okay. No, sorry, it was Norwegian.
Yeah.
No, it was evident that, so I got lost by particular intervention by this.
He's a planted agent by me.
No, he's a Norwegian agent.
But the question, we come back to the question of deterrence. What kind of deterrent can we rely on in the present situation and going forward?
What are we deterring in your question?
We are deterring an escalation to a nuclear war. We are also deterring future war in Europe, because that is not any longer a guarantee that we have, because this happened in February of 2022. Now, I think that from a European perspective, Putin, this was the sacrilege of Putin, because he broke our illusion. You might call it a delusion, but it was the illusion that war between nations would never return to Europe, to the European continent. This has been a part of the European exceptionalism, and it is now broken. Where does Europe go from here?
No, what we are doing in terms of the nuclear issue that we are discussing, the signaling from the Americans is very clear. The signaling from the Chinese and the Indians is equally clear now. Will that be enough? We don't know. On other issues, how do we seek to deter? Well, Sweden and Finland are joining NATO because we think that will give us more security. That's a conclusion that Norway and Denmark took in the late 1940s. I think Norway is highly likely to also increase defense spending. Norway is increasing its security cooperation with the US. Germany is substantially increasing defense spending. Poland is substantially increasing defense spending. Is this enough? I hope it will be enough, because sorry to say, I think what's going to happen is that we're going to be faced with a fairly weak Russia in the years ahead, because I see Russia that will go into, when they don't win this war, and I don't see them winning this particular war, I will see them go into a prolonged period of deep trouble. But that is a danger in itself. An unstable Russia is not a stable neighbor. So we need to safeguard ourselves, not necessarily against the Russian invading Ireland or the UK or Belgium, but safeguard ourselves against an unpredictable and dangerous regime that has a lot of other evil instruments of power. We've seen them using poisonous gas in European countries to murder opponents. It's a nasty place.
I think that with regard to your question, which is obviously a truly important one, Carl and I think about this very differently. The question of how to create deterrence and prevent nuclear escalation. Let's just go back to 2014 when the crisis breaks out. The crisis breaks out in 2014.
John, short question. How would you prevent nuclear escalation?
Well, I'm going to answer. I'm trying to sort of separate myself from you, or differentiate between how we think about this, to sort of get my hands around this whole issue. Because it's a great question, and these are complicated issues that don't have simple answers. But so let's assume it's 2014. The crisis breaks out, as you described it before. The Russians take Crimea. The question is, what do you do then? Let's take Cecilia's questions that she just asked and apply them in 2014 after the crisis has broken out. John's view is you back off, right? It's clear that you're asking for trouble, that you're poking a stick in the bear's eye, and that the bear will eventually lash out and you may end up in a nuclear war. I believe, and Carl can correct me when I'm done, that he would say we should double down, which is what we did. We doubled down. Then in 2021, when Joe Biden came into the White House, we began to reinforce our commitment to Ukraine. It caused all sorts of trouble over the course of 2021. You all remember Russia mobilized its army, was threatening on the borders of Ukraine. And then in December 17th, 2021, the Russians sent a letter to Stoltenberg and to Biden demanding that Ukraine not become a member of NATO, that military forces be moved back to where they were in 1997, and so forth and so on. So the question is, what do you do then? If you could play this one all over again, it's December 17th, 2021. I said at the time, and I'd say now, that's where we should have backed off and worked out a deal, because otherwise you end up with February 24th, right? So I think I know what I would have done before February 24th. But backing off now, it's almost impossible for me to imagine us backing off now, because I'm a minority voice. Carl is the majority voice. He's not interested in backing off. He's interested in doubling down. He's interested in winning in Ukraine, throttling the Russian economy with sanctions. Again, I'm a hardcore realist. I'm an offensive realist. I understand of being hard-nosed in international politics, but I'm more dovish, I think, than you when you're dealing with a state that has thousands of nuclear weapons.
But given the audience has several questions dealing with what kind of scenarios could be realistic for the war in Ukraine to end. Now, given your distinctive positions, how would you see that? What would be a realistic scenario going forward for the war in Ukraine?
Well, I agree with Carl there. When you asked Carl that question in a slightly different form, he basically said it's very hard to figure out where this train is headed. I don't know how this one is going to end. Right? I do want to go to great lengths to make sure we don't end up getting incinerated in a nuclear war, but I don't know where it's going to end.
Because what I hear you say, also from your intervention, is that there is no obvious end to this war because Russia is not going to back down, and the Ukrainians, with support from Europeans and the US, is also not going to back down.
Right, I said that in my formal remarks.
Go back to this Russia-Putin. Putin is not going to back down. And there might be a difference. I think there are a fair number of people in Moscow, even in senior positions, who would be interested in closing down this war tomorrow, if they could.
Would that include Crimea, withdrawing from Crimea?
Probably not. Probably not. So then we will be back to where we were. But prior to sort of February the 24th, where we did not have an agreement on Crimea, and I think it's going to take quite some time to get some sort of solution to Crimea. But I think the other issues, I would not consider it entirely impossible, that at some point in time we get the change, that sort of they understand in Moscow that what they're heading into something that's going to be dangerous for Russia, not because we are going to invade Moscow, that's not going to happen, but it's going to implode. And they will try to rescue what can be rescued and go for something that might be acceptable. But that will only be possible if we can give, and I think we're talking about the post-Putin, it's not going to happen with Putin, and it's also going to be dependent on us helping to secure and give a new future to Ukraine. Because as I said, if we don't get a stable Ukraine, we will not get a stable Europe, because then there will be a constant temptation for, I mean, if you see some of the loonies that are paraded on Russian television these days, they're truly dangerous loonies parading there. will give temptation to them.
But we do not know where this war will end. We do not know where Russia will end up. What we do know is that there is a movement towards a geopolitical rivalry where you have the US and China, coming back to John's intervention, and the US, Russia. Now, where is Europe in all this? No, where is Europe in that picture? Because the rivalry is primarily the dyad between the US and China on the one hand, and you depict it to be the US and Russia on the other, so it's a tripolar dynamic. But where is Europe in that dynamic?
In that particular dynamic, I mean, John mentioned the Taiwan issue as perhaps the most dangerous one, which is really sort of very, very, very different issue because it's really the unresolved civil war from 1949. And the Chinese want to sort of, or Beijing wants to in some sort of way primarily prevent Taiwan from going independent. They would consider that something completely unacceptable. So we are distinctly in favor of a one China principle, we say, however, define it somewhat differently. And we are in favor of a peaceful resolution to it. And we are distinctly against trying to resolve that by military means. Then Europe is not a military power in that part of the world. We are a trading power, we are a diplomatic power, but we are not a military power in that part of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the United States is deeply committed to containing, if not rolling back, Chinese power. And that containment strategy has two dimensions to it. One is a military dimension, and the other is an economic dimension. And in terms of the military dimension, the Europeans are going to play hardly any role at all. I think we agree on that. Where the Europeans are going to matter is on the economic front. And this is a very tricky issue. And there are, of course, now lots of articles in the media on this subject. But the Europeans are going to want to trade extensively with China. This is especially true given the negative economic consequences of the Ukraine war. And it's no accident that early last month, the German chancellor went to Beijing. And there's all sorts of evidence the Europeans are thinking about trading more and more with China. And of course, the Europeans, because they have these sophisticated economies with all these sophisticated technologies, will trade technologies with the Chinese, which will enrage the Americans. The Americans are going to want the Europeans to help Washington throttle the Chinese economy. You are not going to have any interest in throttling the Chinese economy. You're going to have an interest in enhancing your prosperity, facilitating economic growth, and that means more trade with Europe. So I think there is a potential for significant tension between the United States and Europe over the whole issue of trade between Europe and China.
Now, is this not the challenge because we have no good deterrent to prevent war and instability in a more multipolar world, and that means that we are moving over to more hybrid measures. Now, the new US defense strategy talks about integrated deterrence, which is not only military, but which is also integrating all other kinds of domains, all the military domains, but also sanctions and a number of other institutional measures. Now, how does this look from the perspective of Europe? Is the EU ready for that world?
I think to some extent Europe is more ready than the Americans are, in the sense that I said EU is very much a hybrid power. If you talk about all of the different elements of hybrid warfare, they are elements where there are instruments in the hands of the European Union.
Okay, guys, it's time to end this. Part 3. We'll do one final part later on to end this video. But as we see through these parts, it's pretty clear John Mearsheimer has won this debate. And at least in my eyes, this guy has really nothing to say. And now it's becoming more of just a discussion rather than a debate, which is, what we like. we'd like a discussion to start out with. That's the John Mearsheimer approach anyways. He's not really coming at people hard. He just discusses facts and reality, which is why it's called realism, which is, again, crazy. Okay, that's it for now. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.